And today I have the great pleasure of introducing Gabriel Harrison into the studio. Gabriel, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Gabe is a local Santa Cruzian who's got quite a great history here in town, and as well has an amazing artistic history. Although he was trained as a traditional architect, Gabriel works at the intersection of art installation and exhibition design, and it's a great pleasure to have you on the show. And I got to do a big shout out to your parents. They're the Harrison Studio, Helen and Newton Harrison. This is their third of 4 children, and it's a great pleasure to have you up here today to talk about some of your past work and what you're working on right now.
Thank you.
So, Gabe, tell us a little bit about how you started out in architecture, and you spent a large part of your career as an installation artist. Mm-hmm. Tell us, how did that come to be?
Well, I actually came into architecture through anthropology. I was originally interested in the way in which people inhabit space and the way in which the physical surroundings of space actually impact people's lives. And in the beginning, it was I sort of drifted over through working in archaeology and drawing up sites and taking a look at the way in which people lived could be reconstructed through the remains of their physical presence on the ground. And then I started looking more and more at the social aspects of how people in different cultures use various things like kitchens and bathrooms. And through that, I kind of wandered into architecture and started doing design and enjoyed it so much that I stayed. And then, at a certain moment, it became clear that what I really wanted to do was do the reverse. I really wanted to do the design that then, at a certain level, had the potential for improving people's lives. And I became, at Berkeley, I focused on architecture and human behavior. Social design.
That's fascinating. It's not often you talk to an architect who comes at it from an archaeological and anthropological way. And so you graduated from UC Berkeley. You got...
Yeah, both an undergraduate and a graduate degree in architecture from UC Berkeley.
And then what happened next?
Well, then what happened is my parents, Helen and Newton Harrison, who are environmental artists and have been very active for over 40 years in the environmental art movement, they won a competition for creating a large... basically a streetscape. It's a three-dimensional commission, and they had always done conceptual art before that, and they said, help. And I just finished graduate school. I was working for a local architect doing what I thought was going to be my career in social architecture. I'd spent several years in Denmark in between undergraduate and graduate school, again working on social housing and other issues. They called me down, and I started working with the studio with my then partner, Vera Westergaard, and we formed the Harrison Studio with Helen and Newton. And what we did was take their initial entry winning competition, which was for Memorial Gardens at the base of Pico Boulevard, and we started to construct an entire sort of three-dimensional narrative around it. And that's the beginning of it.
And that project is called California Wash, and I had the great pleasure of visiting that project. It's still there today. This was from the early 90s, I believe.
Correct.
And you used colored concrete, I believe, in one of the first ways. So the street, in a way, gives it shows where the river, the Santa... Okay, you tell us.
Well, so yeah, it's an interesting story. So the story behind the winning competition, which was also done with Leslie Ryan and John Perry, who is a landscape architect, was about the very special arroyo system in Los Angeles. And really what happens is the arroyos create a very special ecological niche, and they occupy that niche, and they used to, but they've all been concretized now. But originally, seeds from the high mountains, as these giant storms came racing down, mixed with the hills of the plateaus, and managed to take purchase in the sandy area right at the mouth of the outfall of these waters, and only a specialized grouping of plants could survive the salinity and could meet and mix, and they created these vibrant gardens, essentially 4 ecology gardens, mixing the highlands, the midlands, the flats, and the beach areas. And so they provided a really great piece of biodiversity. And so Helen and Newton decided that what they really wanted to do was memorialize that at the mouth of the river.
And this is in Santa Monica.
Yes, at the end of Pico Boulevard, right next. In fact, it's in front of Shutters on the Beach, and it was paid for as a 1% for art piece, and that's how it got constructed. And essentially, what we did was we, as you say, we created an archaeological drawing on the street. We carved in and cut the various pavements to look like striations in the street. We buried shells and we buried rocks, and we sort of created a de facto archaeological map. We recreated the ecological ensemble mix to represent that. And then we created some symbolic pathways down to the water, and then a map of the water system on the outfall cover, and finally an artistic piece called Wave Fence, which was essentially a tilted, undulating plane of horizontal bars that gave the illusion of waves moving out to sea.
I have to say, Gabe, the project has held up so spectacularly well. The colors in the concrete are bright and beautiful. The fence, the waves is still there. The shadows that it creates on the sand, it's truly a remarkable piece. And then you went on to work with, as you said, you helped create the Harrison Studio, and you've continued working. And then you got into a project at the Tech Museum here in Santa Clara.
Yeah. Well, I should hasten to say that when you mentioned concrete, we actually won a prize from the American Concrete Institute for the most creative use of concrete, because they were so confounded by what we did with it in the mixing. And since then, it's been used in that way several times in public art projects throughout the nation. But it was a very exciting moment. And yes, and then I worked on several large-scale projects at the roof of the Kunst- und Ausstellungshalle in Bonn. We worked on a giant conceptual project for the Green Heart of Holland, and several other projects, and including one at the Bauhaus during that period. And then I moved back to Denmark for several years. And when I came back to California from Denmark, I got a job at the Tech Museum designing what at that time was the first interactive environmental exhibition dealing with processes, dealing with essentially ecological processes inside a science museum.
And this was called the Green by Design.
Yes, Green by Design. And it took its starting point in a book that had just come out called Cradle to Cradle. And the idea behind that was that everything on the planet in our process of production could, if we rethought it intentionally from the outset, recycled, reused, or essentially composted and brought back to its natural ingredients. And so we tried to take that concept, powered by solar energy, so that the entire process was a zero carbon experience. And we tried to bring that into the museum.
And tell us a little bit, how was it interactive?
Okay, so what we did, we actually made a partnership with Stanford University and the Institute for the Environment at the time, and we worked with them to create a series of experiences. So, for example, you would generate your own electricity while playing in the backyard on a carousel, and you would get immediate feedback for what that would mean. We had various parts at the time. The Prius as a vehicle had just come out, and so we went through a series of sort of hands-on experiences of how that was a new technology and why at the time, though now it seems sort of dated, at the time that was a really exciting and new approach to the way in which we can deal with a mass transit issue and things like that.
You're listening to Gabriel Harrison. He's talking a little bit about his past work with the Harrison Studio, coming from an interesting anthropological, archaeological, and architecture background. He moved then into installation design, artistic installation designs, and you've had an amazing career. You've worked both for Yerba Buena Gardens up in San Francisco. You've worked for the Monterey Bay Aquarium and helping develop their interactive installations, and they're doing a really great job with that. And now, right now, the really exciting work you're doing is with CultureStrike.
Right. Well, CultureStrike is a really interesting organization. They were born, Fabiano Rodriguez, Jeff Chen, Andrew Shao, and Carolina Rodriguez. There are several founding members of CultureStrike, but it was born in this incredibly tumultuous period 4 or 5 years ago when a group of migrant artists stormed John McCain's office, created a sit-in, and basically said, we're not going to leave until you change these really horrific immigration policies that you're spearheading in your state, that were really restrictive, really punitive. And because of the success of that, they realized that, they were all undocumented at that point, and the people, not the founders I was talking about, but the people involved in the actual action were undocumented, and they realized that by doing that, collectively they had a voice, and they began to come out of the shadows, and so CultureStrike was born, and the impetus, the real intention of CultureStrike is to change the conversation about changing politics to one that says that you change culture first, and when culture changes, policies change. So you don't go directly into political action. You actually go into cultural action through art. You change the general conversation that's being had in the culture, and then the culture changes policy.
And this is a real intersection of many of your passions and past experiences. The CultureStrike is also about changing national consciousness. Well, that is what you were just saying. It's around these issues of migrant rights, also climate justice.
Yes. So I got involved with CultureStrike because of my work with climate issues, both through working with the Harrison Studio and Greenhouse Britain that I had done, which is an interactive model of the effects of rising sea level on Great Britain and what we can do about that.
Can we just take a moment and describe that incredible installation that you helped create that used projections onto a giant 40-foot map of Great Britain?
Yeah. So essentially, Greenhouse Britain, as a physical installation, is a series of projections, multimedia projections onto a topographical map of the island of Britain. And what it does is it projects rising sea levels and the way in which the climate change over the next 100 years is going to radically reshape the physical landscape of Britain. And Helena Newton's voice is recounted over a 12-minute video talking about the rising sea levels and essentially addressing the fact that we can defend against the rising sea levels and we can withdraw. And what's going to be the impact of that? And it asks the question, as we have millions of people moving up from the shore, will you accept me? Will I accept you? And that was the basis of my work in CultureStrike, which was that same question, is as climate intersects with migration over the next few years, it is going to explode. And in fact, if you look at the roots of the current crisis in Europe around Syria, it really begins with this 5-year devastating drought in Syria that many people feel is directly climate related, forcing millions of people into the cities without water, without livelihood, without food, destabilizing essentially the culture and allowing what's happened to happen.
And I believe you could say that Newton and Helen have been describing this impending cultural. It's going to be a huge conflict as these people have to move out of areas that are no longer habitable.
Correct.
Syria's been experiencing the hottest temperatures that they've ever had, 140 degrees.
Yes.
And how does someone live in that environment, especially if you don't have air conditioning and all these lovely, first world
conveniences.
Yeah.
And of course, what does that do to agriculture and the means of production? And the estimates now recently are that the whole Arabian Peninsula is going to be the equivalent of 165 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, which is physiologically beyond a human being's ability to cool themselves, which means it will not actually be habitable.
Yeah. And what an amazing time for you to be really bringing this consciousness to the world. CultureStrike is right now, with your help, in Paris.
Yes. So essentially what the project that I was working on is called We Are the Storm, which is an undertaking where we took 22 migrant, undocumented people of color, emerging artists, environmentalist artists, and paired them up with 22 frontline organizations across the country and in Canada, looking at all aspects of, or many aspects of, climate change and the production of energy and all of the causes and root causes of climate change. But we looked at it on the ground. And so we brought these artists who were really good at communicating their own ideas and hooked them up with organizations that were really focused on frontline communication. And we said to them, okay, now it's time to get together and take a look at what the most basic emotional elements of your argument are. And then we're going to step back and we're going to get away from this sort of propositional no, yes polemic, and we're going to say, what's the emotional root of what you're trying to say? And we got the artists to step back away from that and begin to create these fine art projects. And there's 22 fine art prints, mostly silkscreen prints now, that are a response to that, with this collaboration between these frontline organizations. And that got sent to Paris during the climate conferences, was put up during the climate event.
That must be so exciting for you, Gabe. Have you heard back from the artists and how it was received?
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting thing in terms of what we're trying to do, because as artists, and this is really the philosophy of CultureStrike, as well as Helen and Newton, I would say my origins working with them are very much the same. And that is the idea that you do not know directly how you're impacting the conversation. You hear back anecdotally that people were impressed, they really liked it, they heard it. But the real impacts are 5 and 10 years from now. People who have seen this, who have been impacted by it, then move on into other positions of power and control. And then they reach back into their own experience and consciousness and make those changes. So there is no direct link. But we know that it's happening.
Well, the seeds have been sown,
yes,
for sure.
Yes.
And in such an incredible, the first time that the world has gotten together and been able to agree on some steps forward.
Yes, it is. And I think it's really important to say that the reason why CultureStrike is unique in their approach to what we're trying to do in the climate realm is that people of color have been invisible, largely, in the climate debate. It's been occupied by white male media in general, and the environmental movements are dominated by sort of white Caucasian groups, and the voices are missing. And so what we really tried to do was center the voices of migrant artists, people of color, within frontline groups that were also largely migrant people of color, in order to bring those forward to tell their stories, because they're the ones impacted. Those frontline, they have to see themselves as empowered and make the changes directly.
And I believe that the executive director, her name is Fabiana Rodriguez. Yes. She talks about how through becoming an artist, she was able to find her voice and able to amplify her voice.
Oh, very much so. And I think in her work, which is really powerful, she weaves issues around reproductive justice, climate justice, and migrant rights together into a very powerful set of images that she makes. And I think is rightly so a very powerful bright light on the stage right now.
And so, Gabe, if somebody is listening right now, they could go to culturestrike.org to find out, because you have many other projects that you're doing right now. But they can also go to San Francisco and see the work. Is that correct? At the Aomi Gallery?
At the Aomi Gallery in Oakland. It's on Broadway, and it's up right now. It's also going to, in the spring, be at YBCA, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, as an exhibit as well. We're going to be working with a group of young artists, people of color, and looking at climate change and social justice and trying to create a integrated exhibit in YBCA towards the spring, the end of the year.
But the exhibition right now that is at 2325 Broadway in Oakland is it's called the Impact Hub Aomi Gallery exhibition is up until January 15th. So there's plenty of time for post-holiday, time to get some art in there.